The little black girl grabbed the biker at the old train station, claiming a man had tracked her since dawn. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It's a gripping tale you won't want to miss. Picture this, a warm, dusty morning at the old train station, the kind where the sun barely rises above the horizon, casting long shadows across the tracks. The air smells faintly of gasoline, metal, and the faint remnants of old train smoke. It was a quiet day, nothing unusual for this remote spot that barely saw any passengers anymore. But that morning, something was different. A small, frightened voice broke the stillness of the station. A little black girl, no older than 8, her eyes wide with terror, ran toward a group of bikers gathered by the platform. Her torn dress fluttered in the wind, and her breath came in sharp gasps as she stumbled over her own feet. She ran straight up to the closest biker, a tall man with a grizzled beard and a leather jacket that screamed authority. She grabbed his arm, her fingers trembling as she clutched his jacket. "Please," she cried, her voice trembling. "Please help me. He's been following me since dawn." The biker paused, the sound of his heavy boots on the gravel stopping for a moment. He looked down at the little girl, his expression softening despite the tough exterior. This wasn't what he expected when he'd pulled up to the station that morning. The girl, no more than a shadow of her usual self, looked up at him with wide, desperate eyes, tears streaming down her dirt-covered face. "Who's following you, kid?" he asked gently, kneeling down to her level. She pointed toward the edge of the station, where a figure in a dark coat stood, barely visible in the distance. The man, his face covered by a hood, seemed to be watching them, his posture unnervingly still. The biker glanced around, his instincts kicking in. Something wasn't right. This little girl was clearly terrified, and the man who had been tracking her was no ordinary passerby. "Don't worry, we'll take care of you," he said, his voice steady but with a hint of concern. The biker stood up and called out to the others, his crew of riders who had been casually talking among themselves. They all turned at once, drawn by the urgency in his tone. The bikers were a close-knit group, bound by more than just the road. They had their own code, a sense of loyalty to each other, and to anyone in need. This little girl was no exception. "Stay here," the biker told the girl as he turned to his crew. The others nodded in agreement, ready to act. They had no idea what they were about to face, but when someone called for help, they didn't hesitate, not even for a second. The biker turned back to the girl, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "You're safe now," he assured her, though part of him felt uneasy. There was more to this story than she was letting on, and he knew it. As they began to move toward the edge of the station, where the man had last been seen, the girl whispered one more time, "He's going to hurt me." The words hung in the air, heavy and filled with the kind of fear only a child could understand. The biker's jaw tightened. It was about to get real. The chase was on. The tension in the air thickened as the biker crew gathered around, their faces hardening with resolve. The little girl, still clutching the biker's leather jacket, looked up at him with eyes full of fear and uncertainty. Her small body trembled, but there was a flicker of hope in her eyes now that she was with people who didn't seem afraid of the man who had been following her. As the others prepared to move, the biker called out to his crew, "Everyone stay sharp. We don't know who this guy is or what he's capable of, but we'll make sure she's safe." His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of someone who had faced real danger before. The bikers, used to the road and the chaos that came with it, moved with precision. They had a job to do. "Let's go," the biker said, turning to face the girl, his voice softening. "We'll take care of this, kid." The girl nodded, her lips trembling, but she said nothing. She pointed toward the distance where the man had been standing, now disappearing into the shadows of the old train station. The crew followed closely, their motorcycles rumbling to life one by one as they revved their engines, preparing for whatever came next. The biker, whose name was Jack, led the group as they navigated the narrow road that ran parallel to the tracks. The faint glow of the station lights flickered behind them as the sound of the bikes cut through the quiet night. Jack kept his eyes on the road, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The man had been too focused, too persistent, following the girl for hours. And Jack had no idea why. "Stay in formation," Jack ordered. "We don't know what we're dealing with, but we stick together." The other bikers, seasoned and used to dangerous situations, nodded without a word. There was no room for hesitation now. The small group of riders formed a tight line as they cruised through the streets. The night was unusually quiet, the only sound being the low hum of their engines and the occasional whistle of wind through the trees. But the further they went, the more Jack could sense something in the air, something that made his instincts go on high alert. The girl's face was etched with fear, and Jack couldn't help but wonder what she had been through. Who was the man who had been following her? Why had he been tracking her since dawn? As they reached a darkened intersection, Jack's eyes scanned the street ahead. A few blocks down, he saw a silhouette, just the faint outline of a car with its headlights dimmed. "There," the girl whispered, pointing toward the car. Jack's heart skipped a beat. The man had to be in there. Without hesitation, Jack signaled the crew to pull over. The bikers parked their bikes quietly, making sure the engines cut off without a sound. Jack approached the car cautiously, his hand resting on the handle of his leather vest, ready for anything. He motioned for the others to stay back. "I'll handle this," Jack said, his voice low but firm. The girl stood behind him, watching with a mix of fear and hope. Jack approached the car, his boots crunching against the gravel. As he drew closer, he could see the shadowy figure of a man sitting behind the wheel. His face was obscured by the shadows, but Jack could tell by his posture that he was waiting for something, or someone. "You're following her," Jack said, his voice cold and commanding. The man didn't move. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint buzz of the distant street lamp. Then, the man slowly turned his head toward Jack, his eyes narrowing. "What's your business with the little girl?" Jack demanded. The man didn't respond at first. Instead, he smirked, a look of defiance crossing his face. Jack could see that this was no ordinary man. There was something about him, something dangerous. He wasn't going to back down. Not easily, anyway. "I'm not your concern," the man said, his voice rough, barely above a whisper. Jack's instincts flared. "You're her concern now," Jack growled, his voice low and filled with menace. The man's eyes flickered to the girl, who had stepped forward, her small hands clenched into fists. Jack felt a surge of protectiveness rise within him. This wasn't just about a stranger following a child anymore. This was about keeping a promise. He could feel the tension building, the weight of the situation pressing on him. He needed to be careful, but he couldn't let this go any longer. "You've been following her for hours. What do you want with her?" Jack's question hung in the air, and the silence between them grew thicker. The man looked away, but his jaw tightened. For a moment, Jack thought he might get an answer. But then the man suddenly shifted in his seat and reached for the door handle. Jack didn't give him a chance. With one swift motion, Jack grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it with enough force to make him wince. "No, you're not going anywhere." The tension in the air was palpable, and for a brief moment, Jack thought the man might try to fight back. But then he saw the fear in the man's eyes, and Jack knew that whatever had brought this man here, it wasn't worth the risk. "You're coming with me," Jack said firmly, pulling the man out of the car. The girl stayed behind, watching as the bikers formed a protective circle around her. Jack's heart was pounding as he marched the man back toward the station, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Something bigger was at play here, something more dangerous than he had expected. The man stumbled as Jack pulled him through the parking lot, his hands still gripping tightly to the man's wrist. The biker's grip was iron, and the man had no choice but to follow, his face pale and tense with fear. The girl, Aisha, stood behind Jack, her small figure dwarfed by the tall, menacing bikers standing in a protective circle around her. She looked at the man with a mixture of fear and confusion, her eyes darting between him and the rest of the bikers. The air was thick with tension, and the quiet hum of the motorcycles was the only sound that filled the otherwise empty street. Jack stopped, momentarily glancing back at his crew before looking at the man again. "You're not going anywhere, not until we figure this out," Jack said, his voice low but filled with authority. The man was sweating now, his jaw tight, but he said nothing. He knew Jack wasn't bluffing. Jack turned back to Aisha. "Stay behind me, kid. We're going to get you out of here." Aisha nodded, but she didn't move from her spot. Her eyes stayed fixed on the man, as if she couldn't quite let go of the fear she felt. Jack knew that feeling all too well, that gnawing feeling of dread that stayed with you long after the danger had passed. But this wasn't over yet. The crew moved with precision, splitting into groups as Jack motioned toward a nearby diner. It was their usual meeting spot, a place where they could figure things out without being overheard. As they walked, the man kept his head low, his feet dragging as if he were resigned to whatever was coming next. The crew formed a tight line behind them, the engines of their bikes still roaring in the background. When they reached the diner, Jack led the group inside, pulling the man through the door and making sure Aisha followed. The little girl stayed close, her eyes scanning the room, her feet shuffling on the floor as if she were unsure of what to do. The diner was nearly empty, save for a few late-night patrons who looked up as the group entered. Jack motioned for the man to sit at the table in the corner, and then he turned to face his crew. "This is it," he said quietly. "We need to figure out who this guy is and what he wants with Aisha." "You sure we can trust him?" one of the bikers, Vince, asked. "He's been following her for hours." "There's something going on here," Jack replied, his voice sharp. "We don't leave until we know the full story." The man sat in silence, his eyes darting nervously from Jack to the rest of the crew. Jack could see the fear in his eyes, but there was something else there too. Something darker, something that didn't belong. It was a kind of arrogance, as if he thought he could control the situation. Jack wasn't about to let that happen. "Who are you working for?" Jack demanded, his voice rising slightly. The man hesitated, then looked up at Jack, his eyes narrowing. "I'm not telling you anything," he muttered. Jack leaned in closer, his voice low and menacing. "You will, or you won't walk out of here on your own 2 feet." The man's eyes flickered with fear, but he didn't say a word. Jack could see the resistance in him, but he also knew that this wasn't going to end until they got the truth. Jack turned to one of his crew members. "Phantom, get the files. We need to know who we're dealing with." Phantom nodded and pulled out his phone, quickly dialing someone. As he spoke to the person on the other end, Jack kept his eyes locked on the man in front of him. He knew they needed answers, and they needed them fast. Aisha, standing quietly by the door, suddenly spoke up. "He's the one who took my brother." The words hit Jack like a punch to the gut. The man flinched, and for the first time since they'd arrived, a flicker of guilt passed across his face. Jack's jaw tightened. "You took her brother?" he asked, his voice low with barely contained rage. The man didn't respond, but his eyes shifted nervously as if he were considering whether or not to run. Jack wasn't going to give him the chance. "You're not going anywhere. Not until we get the full story," Jack said, his voice steady and commanding. "We're not leaving until Aisha gets the answers she deserves." The crew exchanged glances, their expressions hardening. This was no longer just about following some guy around. It was about protecting the girl who had been through enough already. The man finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he muttered, his hands shaking. "I was just doing what I was told." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Who told you to follow her? Who are you working for?" The man hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. I can't tell you that," he said, his voice breaking. Jack leaned forward, his gaze unrelenting. "You don't get to keep secrets anymore. You tell me everything, or you'll regret it." The man gulped, his face turning pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could get a word out, the door to the diner suddenly burst open. The sound of boots on the floor filled the room as a group of men walked in. Jack's eyes narrowed as he recognized them instantly. They were trouble, more than trouble, and they were here for one reason: to take Aisha. The showdown was about to begin. The diner door slammed open, and the heavy thud of boots on the old wooden floor echoed through the quiet space. Jack's instincts kicked in immediately. The bikers tensed, their hands instinctively moving to the grips of their motorcycles as they stood taller. They had dealt with trouble before, but the sight before them was different. These men weren't just thugs. They had an air of something darker, more organized. A man at the front of the group, tall and broad-shouldered, walked in with a cold, calculating gaze. His eyes locked onto Jack with an unspoken challenge, like a predator sizing up its prey. The rest of the men followed him in, their eyes scanning the room, briefly pausing on the girl, Aisha, who was now standing behind Jack, clinging to his jacket like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Jack's heart was pounding. These weren't just ordinary criminals. These were professionals, and they had come for one thing. Aisha. I see you've found her, the man at the front said with a low, gravelly voice, a smirk creeping across his lips. His tone was smooth, but there was a lethal edge to it, like the calm before a storm. Jack took a step forward, blocking the view of Aisha. He wasn't about to let them take her without a fight. What do you want with her? Jack asked, his voice steady but his eyes sharp. That's none of your concern, the man replied, his smirk widening into something more sinister. He stepped forward, and the group behind him followed. We're here to take her, and we will. You're outnumbered, friend. Jack glanced at his crew. There were 6 of them, all big men, all bikers. But against this many, they might have a problem. Still, they weren't backing down. She's not going anywhere, Jack said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. If you want her, you'll have to go through us. The man's eyes flickered to Aisha again. She was now holding herself together, her eyes wide but determined. Jack felt a surge of pride for her. She had been through so much already, and now she was standing tall, despite the fear still lurking in her heart. You're making a mistake, the man said, his voice turning colder. She's a liability to us now. You can't protect her forever. Jack's mind raced. Who were these people? Why was Aisha so important to them? He had a feeling they weren't just after a little girl. There was something bigger here, and he wasn't about to let them get away with it. Jack took another step forward, blocking the man's path. You'll have to get through me first, Jack said, his voice low, but with an unmistakable steel in it. The man chuckled darkly, and for a moment, there was a stillness in the air. Then, without warning, one of the men behind him lunged toward Jack. It all happened in a blur. Jack's reflexes kicked in immediately. He ducked under the attack, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it behind his back. The biker crew moved in unison, blocking the path between Aisha and the intruders. The diner was suddenly filled with the sounds of shouting, of boots hitting the floor, and the unmistakable noise of leather and metal clashing in the confined space. The man in the front watched calmly, his eyes never leaving Jack, as the situation escalated. Jack's grip tightened as he threw the man onto the ground with a force that made the floorboards creak. Stay down, Jack warned, but the man scrambled to his feet, his eyes burning with anger. This isn't over, he spat. Jack didn't flinch. It will be if you walk out now. The other bikers were handling their own, but Jack knew they didn't have much time. They had to end this quickly, or more would come, and they couldn't afford that. Listen, the man in the front finally spoke again, his voice sharp. This is your last chance. Let us take the girl, and we'll walk out. If you don't, it's not just your lives at risk. Jack's jaw tightened. He could feel the weight of the decision. If they let her go, there was no telling what would happen to Aisha. If they didn't, there was no telling how far these men would go to get what they wanted. She stays with us, Jack said, his voice unwavering. You don't get to decide her fate. The man took a step back, signaling to his crew. For a moment, there was silence. Then, just as quickly as they had entered, the group turned and left the diner, but not without one last cold glance in Jack's direction. You think this is over? The man called over his shoulder. You have no idea what you've just done. The door slammed shut behind them, and the air in the diner seemed to deflate, as if the entire building had been holding its breath. Jack stood there for a moment, his hands still gripping the man's jacket, now lying motionless on the floor. The bikers were catching their breath, looking around at each other. They had won this round, but Jack knew this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. He turned to Aisha, who was still standing behind him, her eyes wide with fear, but filled with something else now. Hope. You're safe now, Jack said softly. For now, Aisha whispered, her voice trembling. Jack nodded grimly. He knew it wasn't over. They had just started a war they couldn't back out of. The group stood in stunned silence for a moment after the men left the diner, the door swinging shut behind them with a loud slam. Jack's heart was still racing, and he could feel the adrenaline in his veins. The fight had been intense, but they had come out on top. For now. But the words the man had left hanging in the air echoed in Jack's mind. You have no idea what you've just done. He knew that wasn't an empty threat. The calm warning had felt like a promise of trouble to come. Jack turned to face his crew, his jaw clenched tight. We need to move fast, he said, his voice sharp. We can't stay here much longer. His crew nodded, all of them feeling the weight of the situation. But where do we go? Vince asked, his voice low but steady. We stay together. We keep her safe, Jack replied. His gaze flicked over to Aisha, who was still standing behind him, her small frame trembling slightly, but standing firm. She was a lot stronger than Jack had expected. A lot stronger than she probably realized. We can't stay here, Jack repeated. They'll come back, and next time, it won't be so easy. The crew gathered their things, the sense of urgency hanging thick in the air. Jack took one last look around the diner, making sure no one was watching them. The bikers filed out, their boots heavy on the floor, and Jack made sure to stay in the back, his eyes scanning the street outside as they made their way to their bikes. The little girl followed closely behind, still clutching Jack's jacket. As they walked toward the motorcycles, Jack's mind raced with possibilities. The man's words kept coming back to him. You have no idea what you've just done. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they had just become part of something much bigger than they had realized. Something dangerous. They had no idea who the man was or what he wanted with Aisha, but they sure as hell weren't going to let him take her. We're going to figure this out, kid, Jack said softly, looking down at Aisha as she walked beside him. You're not alone in this anymore. Aisha nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. I know, she whispered. Thank you. They reached the bikes, and Jack motioned for the crew to mount up. As they climbed onto their motorcycles, Jack looked back at Aisha. We're heading to the compound, he said. It's safer there. We'll figure out what's going on, but for now, we need to get you out of here. Aisha's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't say anything. She just nodded, her expression solemn. As the bikers roared to life, the sound of their engines shaking the night air, Jack's mind was still on edge. They had just fought off a group of dangerous men, but he knew it wasn't over. The real battle was just beginning. Stay close, Jack called to the group as they took off down the road. And stay sharp. The night air whipped past them as they sped down the highway, the lights of the town fading in the distance. The crew rode in formation, the sound of their engines echoing in the quiet night. The desert stretched out before them, the road long and empty. Jack kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, scanning for any sign of the men who had just threatened them. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He'd been in enough dangerous situations to know when something wasn't right. We're not far now, Jack said as they approached the outskirts of the compound. The gates loomed ahead, a fortress of steel and iron. It was a place that had been built for moments like this. A safe haven. Jack's eyes stayed focused on the road ahead, but he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in his gut. They had no idea what they were walking into. But he wasn't going to let anything happen to Aisha, not while he was still breathing. They reached the gates, and one of the crew members pulled up to the guardhouse, giving the signal. The gates slowly creaked open, and they rode inside. The compound was quiet, the stillness of the desert surrounding them. As they parked their bikes, Jack turned to Aisha, who had been eerily quiet during the ride. You're safe here, he said, his voice softer now. We'll figure this out. Aisha didn't respond immediately. She just looked around the compound, taking in her surroundings. She seemed to be processing everything, the weight of the day's events settling in. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack nodded. We're not done yet, kid, he said. But you're safe here. As the rest of the crew dismounted and began to gather their gear, Jack pulled out his phone and dialed a number. The phone rang once, then twice. Finally, a voice answered. Jack, the voice said, gruff but familiar. What's going on? Jack's eyes narrowed. We need answers. And we need them now. I'm on it, the voice said. Stay put. I'll have something for you soon. Jack hung up and turned back to the group. They were all here, safe for now. But Jack knew the calm wouldn't last. The storm was still coming, and this time, they wouldn't be able to fight their way out of it. Jack had promised Aisha's father that he would protect her, and now he had to follow through. But what if the danger was bigger than he could handle? What if they weren't just fighting for Aisha's safety, but for their lives as well? The compound was eerily quiet as Jack stood by his bike, his mind still racing from everything that had transpired. They had made it here, to safety, for now. But the threat wasn't over. The words from the man earlier echoed in his mind. You have no idea what you've just done. Jack knew it wasn't an empty threat. This was bigger than just a man stalking a little girl. Whoever these people were, they were dangerous, and now they had targeted him and his crew. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were all in far deeper than they had anticipated. Aisha stood a few feet away, her eyes scanning the compound as she took in the surroundings. She was still quiet, almost too quiet, as if everything was beginning to hit her. Jack watched her for a moment before walking over. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. Aisha nodded, though she didn't say anything at first. Her eyes darted around, as if she was trying to find something familiar in this strange new world she had been thrown into. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. Jack's heart tightened, but he didn't let it show. She had been through hell today. She deserved to feel safe. But safety here was fleeting. He could feel it. "You don't need to thank me," Jack replied, his voice steady. "We keep our promises. And your father trusted me to keep you safe." Aisha gave him a faint smile, but the weight of the day was clearly still pressing on her. Jack could see it in her eyes. She had lost more than just a day of her life. She had lost her innocence. "I don't know. What's going on?" Aisha said, her voice cracking slightly. "Who were those people?" Jack ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. "I don't know yet," he said, his voice low. "But we'll find out. You're safe here for now." As Jack spoke, the sound of boots on gravel caught his attention. He turned to see one of his crew members, Phantom, approaching. "I got something," Phantom said, his voice steady. Jack nodded and motioned for him to continue. Phantom pulled out a folded piece of paper and handed it to Jack. "I dug into the records like you asked," he said. "Turns out, the guy you tangled with back there is a small player in a much larger game. He works for a guy named Marcus Viper Santana." Jack's brows furrowed at the name. "Who is he?" he asked. "Viper Santana is a major player in the underground world," Phantom continued. "Racketeering, human trafficking, weapons smuggling. He's got his hands in everything. And he's been waiting for something like this. He's ruthless. He doesn't take no for an answer." Jack felt his stomach drop. This wasn't just about Aisha. This was bigger. A lot bigger. "What's he want with her?" Jack asked, his tone hardening. Phantom shook his head. "I don't know yet. But if he's involved, it's not good. This isn't just a kidnapping. He's got a whole operation going. And he's got the resources to come after you and your crew." Jack clenched his fists. He wasn't going to let that happen. Not while he could still fight. "We need to find out everything we can about this Viper," Jack said, his voice steady. "And we need to get ahead of this before he makes another move." Phantom nodded. "I'll dig deeper. See what I can find." "Good. But we can't wait too long," Jack warned. "We need to be ready for whatever comes next." As Phantom walked away to gather more information, Jack turned to Aisha, who was still standing there, her eyes wide with uncertainty. He could see the fear in her eyes. This was a lot for a little girl to handle. "We're going to get through this, Aisha," Jack said, his voice calm but firm. "You're not alone anymore. We're here for you." Aisha nodded, though her lips trembled slightly. "Thank you," she whispered again, her voice barely audible. Jack smiled softly, but the weight of what they were facing was pressing down on him more than ever. This wasn't just about protecting Aisha anymore. They were up against something much bigger, something that had the power to tear everything apart. Jack turned and looked at his crew, who were gathered around, ready to do whatever it took. "We stick together," Jack said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "We're family, and nobody messes with our family." His crew responded with a chorus of nods and murmurs of agreement. They were ready. The fight was coming, and they would stand together. Jack didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. They would take the fight to Viper Santana. They would not back down. Not this time. "Let's get some rest," Jack said, turning toward the building that housed their temporary quarters. "We'll need our strength for what's coming." The crew nodded and followed him inside. But Jack stayed at the door for a moment longer, staring out into the night. He didn't know how long they had before the storm hit, but he was ready for it. They were all in this together, and they weren't going to let anything tear them apart. The sound of the motorcycles fading into the distance was the only thing left to remind Jack that this was far from over. They were just getting started. The night was still, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that it was about to get much louder. The peace of the compound was fragile, and every creak of the building, every whisper of the wind outside, seemed like a warning. He sat alone in the dimly lit room, his fingers tapping restlessly on the wooden table in front of him. Aisha was asleep in the next room, the sound of her soft breathing the only real sign of tranquility. Jack's thoughts, however, were a storm. His crew had gathered earlier, going over their next steps. Phantom had gotten a few leads on Marcus Viper Santana, but the information was sparse, just enough to confirm the danger they were up against, but not nearly enough to track him down. Jack leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for a moment. He was running out of time, and he knew it. Viper wasn't the type to back down. He was patient, ruthless, and he had a network that stretched far beyond what Jack and his crew could handle alone. "We need to hit him first," Jack muttered under his breath, his voice low and filled with determination. He knew it wouldn't be easy. The only way they would stand a chance was to disrupt Viper's operations, to go after the heart of the syndicate before it could spread its roots any deeper. Just as he was about to stand up, the sound of a knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He immediately stood, his hand instinctively moving to the knife tucked into his belt. His heart skipped a beat, but then the door creaked open, and Vince walked in, his face grim. "We've got a problem," Vince said, his voice urgent. Jack felt his pulse quicken. "What's going on?" "We found something," Vince replied. "Not much, but it's enough to worry about." Jack nodded and followed Vince out of the room. They made their way down the hall to the small makeshift office the crew had set up. Phantom was there, leaning over a stack of papers, his face tense. When he saw Jack, he looked up. "We've got a lead," Phantom said, his voice tight with focus. "Aisha's father, what about him?" Jack cut in, his heart pounding. "He wasn't just a regular guy," Phantom continued, looking at Jack intently. "He was more involved with Viper than we thought. Looks like he was working as an informant for a while. He was trying to take down Viper's operation from the inside." Jack froze. "You're telling me her father was a part of this?" Vince nodded. "Yeah, but it gets worse. Aisha's father was in deep. Real deep. He wasn't just feeding information. He was gathering it for a larger operation, one that could bring down Viper." Jack felt a cold chill run down his spine. If Aisha's father had been a part of this, it meant that they had unknowingly walked right into the heart of something much bigger. "But why didn't he tell us?" Jack muttered. "Why keep it a secret from her?" "I think he was trying to protect her," Phantom said, his voice softer now. "From what he knew would come after him. And after her, now that he's gone." Jack's mind was racing. If her father had been working against Viper, it made sense why the syndicate was now after Aisha. She was the key. She had something they wanted, something that could bring Viper down. But what? "We need to find out what Aisha's father had on Viper," Jack said, his voice hard with resolve. "And we need to do it fast. We can't afford to wait any longer." The urgency in his voice was clear, and his crew immediately started moving. They knew what was at stake now. This wasn't just about protecting Aisha anymore. It was about taking down one of the most dangerous men alive. Vince looked at Jack, his expression serious. "We're going to need more than just information," he said. "We'll need backup. If we're going up against Viper, we need to be ready for war." Jack didn't hesitate. "I'll call in the reinforcements. But we'll need to move quickly. Every second we waste is another second Viper has to find her." As Jack picked up his phone to make the call, he felt the weight of the situation press down on him. This was bigger than anything they had dealt with before. It wasn't just about saving Aisha anymore. It was about taking down an empire. And Jack wasn't going to stop until Viper was behind bars. He ended the call and turned to his crew. "Get ready. We leave at dawn." The crew nodded in unison, their expressions hardening. They were ready for this fight. And for the first time since all of this began, Jack felt a sense of certainty. They were going to end this. They were going to take Viper down. As the crew gathered their gear, Jack looked out the window of the compound. The sky was still dark, but the first light of dawn was starting to break through. The storm was coming. And this time, they weren't going to let it pass them by. The first light of dawn broke across the sky as Jack stood in front of the compound, his hand resting on the handle of his motorcycle. His mind was still racing from everything that had happened. It felt like everything had come crashing down all at once, but he had no choice now. There was no turning back. The crew was already assembling by their bikes, preparing for the mission ahead. Every single one of them knew what was at stake. Aisha's life wasn't the only one in danger anymore. If they didn't stop Marcus Viper Santana, countless others would suffer. Jack felt the weight of the responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. It wasn't just about taking down a criminal. It was about stopping an empire from continuing its reign of terror. Jack took a deep breath and walked over to his crew. "All right, we're heading straight to Viper's base," Jack said, his voice calm but laced with a quiet intensity. "We've got one shot at this. We hit hard and fast. No hesitation. The crew nodded in agreement. They had been in dangerous situations before, but this was different. Viper wasn't just another gang leader. He was a powerful figure with connections everywhere, and now they were going to take him down. Jack glanced at Aisha, who stood near the bikes, her small figure dwarfed by the towering presence of the bikers around her. She had come a long way from the terrified little girl they had first met. She was strong, resilient, but Jack could see the lingering fear in her eyes. She had lost so much already. You ready for this? Jack asked gently. Aisha looked up at him, her eyes clear and determined. I have to be, she said softly. Jack gave her a small smile, but inside, he knew there was more to this fight than just taking down Viper. They were fighting for Aisha's future, but also for the futures of everyone who had been affected by Viper's crimes. All right, everyone, let's move out, Jack ordered. The bikers revved their engines, and the sound of their roaring motorcycles filled the air as they rolled out of the compound. The group moved in formation, the wind whipping through the desert as they made their way to Viper's hideout. Jack led the way, his mind focused on the road ahead. He could feel the tension in the air. They were getting closer to Viper's territory, and the risk of an ambush was high. Jack had been in enough dangerous situations to know that they had to be prepared for anything. As they approached a narrow road, Jack signaled for the crew to slow down. They could see the outline of a large, abandoned warehouse in the distance. This was it. Viper's base. Jack's heart was pounding, but he kept his focus. They had a job to do. We'll park up ahead and move in on foot, Jack said. Stay sharp. Don't let your guard down for a second. They parked their bikes behind a row of abandoned buildings, making sure to keep out of sight. Jack's crew dismounted and moved quickly into position. They knew the plan by heart. They would infiltrate the warehouse, find Viper, and take him down. Simple, but not easy. Jack checked his gear one last time and gave a nod to his crew. They were ready. As they moved closer to the warehouse, the sound of their footsteps was muffled by the wind. Jack led the way, his senses on high alert. The closer they got, the more he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He knew that Viper wouldn't go down without a fight, but Jack wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. They reached the edge of the warehouse and crouched behind some crates, waiting for the signal. Jack could see shadows moving inside, the faint outline of guards patrolling the area. We move in on my mark, Jack whispered, his voice low and steady. The crew nodded. Jack took a deep breath and then made his move. Go, he barked. The bikers moved quickly, charging toward the entrance. The sound of their boots hitting the ground was drowned out by the roar of engines as Jack's crew stormed into the building. The guards inside were caught off guard. Before they could react, the bikers had already disarmed them and taken control. Jack moved swiftly, scanning the room for any sign of Viper. The warehouse was dark, but Jack's instincts told him that they were close. Viper, Jack called out, his voice echoing through the empty space. Come out, you coward. There was a moment of silence before the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the warehouse. Jack's heart skipped a beat. Viper had arrived. He was flanked by several men, all armed and ready for a fight. Jack didn't hesitate. He charged forward, his fist connecting with one of the men who tried to block his path. The other bikers followed suit, engaging in a fierce battle with Viper's crew. But Jack's focus was on Viper. He had to end this now. As the fight raged on, Jack made his way toward Viper, who was standing in the back of the warehouse, smirking. You think you can stop me? Viper sneered, his voice cold and full of malice. You're nothing but a bunch of bikers. Jack didn't flinch. You're done, he said firmly. This is the end of the line. With one swift move, Jack lunged at Viper, knocking him to the ground. The fight was far from over, but Jack could feel the victory within his grasp. The bikers were taking down Viper's men, one by one, and Jack wasn't going to let this chance slip away. He grabbed Viper by the collar and hauled him up, his eyes burning with anger. You're going to pay for what you've done, Jack growled. Viper's smirk faded, and for the first time, Jack saw fear in his eyes. Jack knew they were winning, but there was still more to do. They weren't done yet. The struggle was fierce. Jack held Viper by the collar, his grip tightening as the man squirmed beneath him. His crew fought off Viper's remaining men, and the sounds of fists hitting flesh and bodies hitting the ground filled the warehouse. The air was thick with the tension of a fight that could tip in either direction, But Jack knew they couldn't stop now. Aisha's safety, the lives of everyone they cared about, depended on this moment. Jack's breath was steady despite the chaos. He could feel the weight of Viper's glare, and for a moment, the world around him seemed to slow. Viper, now pinned to the cold concrete floor, looked up at Jack with a sneer, the arrogance still in his eyes. "You think you've won?" Viper spat, his voice dripping with venom. "This is just the beginning. You have no idea what you're up against." Jack leaned in closer, his face just inches from Viper's. "I know exactly what I'm up against," Jack said, his voice low and dangerous. "And I'm done playing games. This ends now." The struggle continued, but Jack kept his focus on Viper. The man was dangerous, no doubt about it, but Jack wasn't going to let him walk away this time. The rest of the bikers had finished taking care of Viper's men, and now they stood in the shadows, watching Jack handle the situation. They had his back, but Jack was taking charge of this one. "You won't get away with this," Viper said, his voice more desperate now. "I have connections. People in high places. You think you can take me down that easily?" Jack's eyes narrowed. "I'm not interested in your connections," he said, his voice cold. "I'm interested in making sure you never hurt anyone again." Viper opened his mouth to say something, but Jack wasn't waiting for him to finish. With one swift motion, Jack pulled out his knife and pressed the blade to Viper's throat. The room went silent. "You're done," Jack said. "You're going to rot in prison for the rest of your life, and when you're gone, there won't be anyone to take your place. You've had your run. Now it's over." Viper's face contorted with rage, but Jack didn't flinch. He had heard enough. He wasn't afraid of this man or his threats. The only thing Jack cared about was stopping him from causing any more damage. "Take him away," Jack ordered, his voice steady and final. The crew moved in quickly, securing Viper's hands behind his back. They pulled him to his feet, ignoring his attempts to resist. They had done what they came to do. Viper was going down, and nothing was going to change that. As they dragged Viper toward the exit, Jack turned and looked over at his crew. They were all breathing hard, their bodies tense, but their faces filled with the same sense of satisfaction. They had fought hard, but they had won. "Is everyone all right?" Jack asked. The crew nodded, their faces hard but proud. "Yeah, we're good," Vince said, his voice gruff but steady. "We did what we had to do." Jack turned his attention to Aisha, who had been standing by the side of the room, watching everything unfold. She looked a little shaken but stood tall, her eyes steady. "You all right?" Jack asked gently. Aisha nodded, though her expression was still somber. "I think so," she whispered. "Thank you." Jack smiled softly, though his heart was still heavy. They had taken down one of the most dangerous men alive, but the cost had been high. Aisha had been through so much already, and it wasn't over for her yet. "You're safe now," Jack said, his voice comforting but resolute. "As long as we're standing, we'll keep you safe." Aisha looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. She had lost so much, but now, maybe, she could finally find some peace. Jack's phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out, seeing an alert flash across the screen. His blood ran cold as he read the message. "They know where we are," Jack muttered under his breath. "Viper's people. They're not done yet." The room fell silent again, the weight of the message settling in. This wasn't over. The battle had only just begun. Jack looked at his crew, his resolve hardening. "Get ready. We're not leaving until this is finished. We fight together, or not at all." The crew exchanged determined glances. They knew Jack meant business. They were all in this together, and they wouldn't back down. Jack turned to Aisha, his expression softening. "Stay close," he said. "We'll keep moving. But we're not stopping until you're safe, and these guys are behind bars." Aisha nodded, her face reflecting the strength Jack knew she had inside her. Jack looked at his crew one last time before stepping forward, ready to face whatever came next. The storm was coming, and they were going to meet it head-on. The tension in the air was palpable as Jack and his crew prepared for the next phase of the operation. They had successfully captured Viper, but the message on Jack's phone had made one thing painfully clear. This fight was far from over. The storm wasn't just on the horizon. It had already arrived, and they were in the thick of it. The safe house, where they had been holed up, suddenly didn't feel so safe anymore. Jack stood by the window, looking out at the empty street below. The dim light of the street lamps cast long shadows, and the wind howled through the deserted town. carrying with it a sense of unease. They were exposed. They had to move fast. They know where we are, Jack said, turning to his crew. We don't have much time. Vince, his second in command, was already loading his gun, his face hard with determination. We fight to the end, Jack, he said. We're not running from this. Jack nodded, his gaze steely. He knew Vince was right. Running wasn't an option. Not anymore. The man they had just captured, Marcus Viper Santana, was a powerful figure in the criminal world. But Viper was only one part of a much bigger operation. And if they didn't put an end to it now, they risked it spreading like wildfire. We need to get to Viper's safe house, Jack continued, his voice calm but filled with resolve. That's where the rest of his crew will be hiding out. And we need to shut it down before they regroup. His crew nodded, each member preparing for the battle ahead. They knew the stakes were high, but they also knew that they had no choice. This was the fight that would determine their future. Jack turned to Aisha, who was standing in the corner, still shaken but resolute. She had been through more than any child should have to endure, and yet, here she was, standing tall and ready to fight. You sure you're okay? Jack asked, his voice softening. Aisha looked up at him, her eyes steady. I'm not scared anymore, she said, her voice clear and strong. I know you'll protect me. Jack gave her a small smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. He couldn't promise her that everything would be okay. What he could promise was that they would fight with everything they had. We're going to end this, Aisha, Jack said, his tone firm. We're going to take down Viper and make sure no one else ever gets hurt. Aisha nodded, her hands clenched into fists. She was ready, and so were they. The bikers revved their engines, the sound of the motorcycles roaring to life filling the compound. As they lined up, Jack took one last look at Aisha. She had become like family to them, and he wasn't about to let anything happen to her. The convoy sped down the dark road, their headlights cutting through the night like a wave of fury. The distance between them and Viper's safe house was closing fast. Jack's mind raced, but his focus was sharp. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes. They needed to hit Viper hard and fast. No hesitation. We're close, Vince said, his voice coming through Jack's earpiece. Stay sharp. Viper's people are probably waiting for us. Jack nodded, his grip on the handlebars tightening. We go in, take them out, and get Viper. The safe house was just up ahead. Jack could feel the adrenaline surge as they pulled off the road and into a narrow, dirt lane. The place was abandoned, but there were signs that someone had been here recently. The shadows cast by the dilapidated buildings seemed to move, making it clear they weren't alone. The bikers dismounted quickly, their eyes scanning the area. Jack signaled for the group to stay in position as they made their way toward the entrance. On my mark, Jack whispered. We move in. Fast. No mistakes. As they approached the door, Jack's heart raced. They were so close. He could feel it. This was the moment that would change everything. The crew was ready. The plan was simple. Find Viper, end the threat, and get out. But nothing was ever that simple. As Jack reached for the door, a loud crash sounded from inside. Someone had spotted them. The gunfire erupted almost instantly, the sharp cracks of the shots splitting the air. Jack dove behind cover, signaling for the crew to return fire. The room lit up with the flash of gunfire as the bikers engaged, their years of experience allowing them to stay calm under pressure. Jack moved swiftly, taking out two of Viper's men with precise shots before pushing forward. The fight was chaotic, but Jack kept his focus. He had one mission, to find Viper and make sure he was the last man standing. He kicked down a door and burst into a room, his gun raised. There he was, Viper, standing by a window, watching the scene unfold. The smug look on his face faded as he saw Jack. You think you've won? Viper sneered, his voice cold and calculating. This is just a setback. You have no idea how many people I have working for me. Jack's finger tightened on the trigger, but he didn't fire just yet. You're done, Jack said, his voice unwavering. It's over. You're going to rot in prison. Viper looked around, his eyes darting to the door, but he didn't make a move. Jack stepped forward, keeping his gun trained on him. You'll never hurt anyone again, Jack said, his voice cold with finality. The rest of the bikers had cleared the room, and now it was just Jack and Viper. Get on your knees, Jack ordered. Viper hesitated, then slowly dropped to the floor. Jack had won. But as the crew secured Viper and his men, Jack knew that this was just the beginning. There were still more people to stop, more lives to save. But for now, they had won. And for Jack, that was enough. The quiet that followed the battle felt surreal, a stark contrast to the chaos they had just endured. Jack stood near the back of the warehouse, his hands still slightly trembling from the intensity of the fight. Viper was secured, sitting in the corner, guarded by two of the bikers. His smug expression was gone, replaced by a deep scowl as he realized the extent of his defeat. Jack didn't feel the victory as much as he had hoped. This was just the beginning, and they all knew it. The fight to bring down Viper had been long, but the war to take down his empire was only starting. Jack turned to his crew, his voice low but filled with a new determination. We need to find out who Viper's working with. He's not the only one behind this operation. Vince, who had been wiping blood from his hands, nodded in agreement. We got him, but we're not done yet. We can't let his people slip through the cracks. Jack turned toward Aisha, who had been standing quietly in the corner, her face a mixture of exhaustion and relief. She had been through so much already, and Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of protectiveness toward her. She had lost everything, but now she was with them. You okay? Jack asked, his voice softening as he walked toward her. Aisha looked up at him, her eyes tired but determined. I'm fine, she said, her voice steady. But I want to know what happens next. Jack gave her a reassuring smile, but inside, he knew the road ahead was far from simple. We're going to end this. We'll take down everyone who's a part of this. You're not alone anymore. Aisha nodded, her eyes hardening with resolve. She wasn't a child anymore. She had become part of their world, and Jack wasn't going to let anyone take her away. The crew moved into the next phase of the plan. They needed information, and Viper was the key to unlocking everything. Jack walked over to where Viper was sitting, the man's hands bound tightly behind him. The once confident kingpin was now reduced to nothing more than a captured criminal, and it was time for him to pay for his actions. You think you've won? Viper spat, trying to hold on to his pride despite the chains that bound him. You don't know who you're dealing with. My men are everywhere. They'll come for you. Jack didn't flinch. Your empire is done, he said, his voice calm but laced with the weight of finality. Now, tell me who you're working with. Who's really behind this operation? Viper sneered. You think I'm going to tell you anything? Jack leaned in closer, his eyes locked onto Viper's. You'll tell me everything, Jack said, his voice steady. Or I'll make sure you never see the light of day again. For a moment, there was silence between them, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, Viper's expression shifted, and Jack knew they were getting somewhere. You don't know who you're messing with, Viper said slowly, his eyes shifting nervously. You think this is just about me? There's a lot more going on here. People you've never even heard of. Jack pressed harder. Who are they? Viper looked away, his gaze flickering toward the door. Jack's patience was wearing thin. You're going to talk. Now. Viper let out a frustrated sigh, then finally spoke. There's a group behind me. We've been working on this operation for years. People with money, influence, power. They're not just some street-level criminals. They're deep in the system. People in high places, police, politicians, businessmen. Jack felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't just a gang war. This was an entire network, deeply entrenched in every part of society. Who are they? Jack pressed. You can't do this on your own. You need to know who you're up against. Viper laughed bitterly. You really think I'm going to give you names? You're wasting your time. Jack's gaze hardened. You're not in charge anymore. You'll give me names, or I'll make sure you regret it. Viper's eyes flickered for a moment. Then he looked back at Jack. Fine, he said begrudgingly. But you won't stop them. No one can. Jack didn't wait for him to finish his sentence. He grabbed Viper by the collar and pulled him closer. Who are they? He demanded. Viper swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously. There's a man, he said quietly. A man you'll never be able to reach. His name is Gabriel Blackwood. He's the one who runs everything. He's untouchable. Jack felt his stomach drop. Gabriel Blackwood. The name echoed in his mind, and he knew instantly that this was the next step. This wasn't just about taking down a local crime boss. This was about taking down a shadowy figure at the top of the criminal world. Where do I find him? Jack asked, his voice low and dangerous. Viper hesitated, then sighed. You won't find him. He's in the system, in the shadows. He's too well protected. Jack's jaw tightened. I don't care how protected he is. I'm coming for him. Viper smirked, though the fear was now evident in his eyes. You won't get far. He has eyes everywhere. Jack stood up, motioning for his crew to move in. Get Viper ready for transport. We're going after Blackwood. The bikers moved quickly, securing Viper and preparing him for transport. Jack's mind was already racing ahead. Gabriel Blackwood was their next target, and he was going to make sure that this time, they were ready. This fight was far from over, and it would take everything they had to take down the people behind Viper's empire. But Jack wasn't afraid. Not anymore. He would do whatever it took to finish this fight and protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The day had barely broken when Jack and his crew moved out, the weight of what lay ahead pressing on them with each step. They had Viper in custody, but Gabriel Blackwood loomed like a shadow in the distance, a target that was no longer out of reach. Jack's mind raced as they made their way down the road, heading for the rendezvous point where they would meet with their reinforcements. The urgency in his chest was almost unbearable. Every second felt like a ticking time bomb, but he pushed it down. This wasn't the time for doubt. It was the time for action. Aisha sat quietly on the bike behind him, her small frame tucked close to his back. He could feel her trembling slightly, but she didn't say a word. Jack didn't look back at her. Instead, he focused on the road ahead, the rumble of the engines beneath them filling the air. This was for her. This was for everyone who had suffered at the hands of people like Viper and Blackwood. They would pay for what they had done. Jack had promised Aisha's father that he would protect her, and now that promise was about to be fulfilled. The road stretched ahead, long and empty, but Jack knew that they were riding straight into danger. The sun was rising higher, casting a cold, golden light across the barren landscape, but it didn't make Jack feel any safer. The world outside was quiet, as if the land itself held its breath, waiting for the storm that was about to come. The safe house they had been hiding in was no longer an option. Viper's people were closing in, and they had to move quickly before they were cornered. The bike engines hummed loudly as the group rolled into the small town on the outskirts of the city. The streets were eerily silent, but Jack knew that would change soon. Blackwood had eyes everywhere. The crew stopped in front of a small, abandoned building that seemed to have been abandoned for years. They dismounted, checking their gear and weapons. Jack looked over at Aisha, who was standing next to the bike, her eyes scanning the surroundings nervously. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer now, the raw intensity of the mission fading for a moment. Aisha nodded, her eyes bright but uncertain. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady but with a hint of fear. Jack smiled at her, though it didn't reach his eyes. "We'll get through this," he said firmly. "Stick close, and you'll be fine." As the crew entered the building, Jack's mind was already running through the next steps. They had no time to waste. They needed to find Blackwood, and they needed to do it fast. The building was dark and damp, the air thick with dust and decay. They moved through the halls quickly, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Every corner could hide a threat, every door a trap. Jack wasn't about to let his guard down. His heart was pounding, but his senses were on high alert. Blackwood wasn't going to be easy to find. He would have his own people here, watching their every move, waiting for them to slip up. But Jack couldn't afford to let that happen. He couldn't afford to fail. As they moved through the building, Jack's mind raced. Where would Blackwood be? What was he planning? He knew they had to be close. Just as Jack rounded the corner, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "You really think you can walk in here and just take me down?" Jack stopped dead in his tracks. The voice was smooth, cold, and filled with an arrogance that Jack could almost feel physically. He turned, his heart skipping a beat, to see Gabriel Blackwood standing at the end of the hall, flanked by two men. Jack's muscles tensed, and he could feel the weight of the moment settling over him. This was it. The man they had been hunting for so long was finally standing in front of him. "You're not getting away this time," Jack said, his voice low and steady, filled with an anger he had been holding back for far too long. Blackwood smirked, his hands tucked casually into his pockets, his posture relaxed, as if he wasn't facing down a group of armed bikers. "I don't think you understand the situation," Blackwood said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're outmatched. You've been outplayed from the start." Jack's grip tightened on his gun, but he didn't make a move yet. He wasn't going to rush this. He couldn't afford to. "I'm not here for your games, Blackwood," Jack said, stepping forward. "I'm here to put an end to everything you've built. You're done." Blackwood's smirk faded for a moment, and Jack could see the flicker of something else. Fear, maybe, or surprise. He wasn't sure, but it was enough to give him a sliver of hope. "You think you can stop me?" Blackwood said, his voice colder now. "I'm untouchable. Do you really think a few bikers can bring down everything I've worked for?" Jack didn't hesitate. "You've made your last mistake." With that, the fight erupted. The crew moved in fast, weapons drawn, and the two men flanking Blackwood rushed forward, but Jack was faster. He dove to the side, his gun raised, and fired 2 quick shots. One hit the man closest to him, sending him crashing to the ground. The other missed, but it was enough to make the second man hesitate. Blackwood didn't move, his eyes locked on Jack. "You're too late," Blackwood said, his voice quieter now, his smirk gone. "You have no idea what's coming." Jack didn't respond. Instead, he fired again, this time hitting the second man in the leg, knocking him down. He moved forward, gun raised, ready to finish this. This was it. This was the moment they had been working toward. Jack wasn't going to let anyone stand in their way. Blackwood was going down, and this time, there was no escape. The air was thick with tension, the final confrontation raging in the dimly lit warehouse. Jack moved with the precision of a man who knew what was at stake, his gun trained on Blackwood as the two men faced each other. The fight was brutal, but Jack wasn't about to back down. This was it, the moment that would decide everything. He had been hunting Marcus Viper Santana and his syndicate for months, and now the mastermind behind it all, Gabriel Blackwood, was finally in his sights. But Blackwood wasn't going down without a fight. He was no longer the smug, untouchable man Jack had seen earlier. His face was taut with fear, eyes darting around the warehouse as if looking for a way out. "You can't stop this," Blackwood hissed, his breath shallow. "Even if you kill me, the operation is bigger than you think. You've already lost." Jack's grip tightened on his gun, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He knew that if they didn't put an end to this, Viper's empire would only continue to grow, more lives would be ruined, and more people would be hurt. "This ends tonight," Jack said, his voice cold with determination. The moment Blackwood had been stalling for arrived. He lunged toward the door, his body moving with a speed Jack didn't expect. But Jack was faster. In a flash, he stepped forward, his gun raised, and fired 2 shots, one hitting Blackwood in the shoulder, the other in his leg. The man crumpled to the ground with a gasp, his face contorting in pain. Jack moved toward him, his boots heavy on the concrete floor, each step bringing him closer to the end of this nightmare. Blackwood groaned, trying to push himself up, but Jack kicked the gun out of his reach, keeping the barrel of his own weapon aimed at Blackwood's face. "It's over," Jack said, his voice unwavering. Blackwood's eyes burned with rage and disbelief, but there was no escape now. "You think you've won?" Blackwood spat, the words dripping with venom. "You're nothing but a pawn in a game that's much bigger than you. You'll never win. You'll never stop us." Jack didn't flinch. He had heard the same threats over and over again, but none of them ever stopped him. "You're wrong," Jack said, stepping back and motioning for his crew to move in. "Your empire ends here. Now." The crew flooded into the room, securing Blackwood's men and taking control of the building. It was over. The operation was dismantled. Blackwood, now disarmed and helpless, was dragged away by 2 of the bikers, his face twisted with hate. Jack stood in the middle of the room, his gun still in his hand, his mind finally starting to process the victory. But there was no time to celebrate. He had one last thing to do. He turned to Aisha, who had been standing at the back of the room, her eyes wide as she took in everything. Jack walked over to her, his face softening. "It's over," he said gently, though his voice was still firm. "You're safe now. You don't have to be afraid anymore." Aisha looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude but still haunted by everything she had seen. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. Jack's heart ached for her. She had been through so much, had lost so much, and yet here she was, standing strong in the face of it all. "You don't need to thank me," Jack said, his voice softer now. "I made a promise to your dad, and I'm going to make sure you're okay." Aisha nodded, though the weight of her emotions still hung heavily in the air. She had been through hell, but now, maybe, there was a chance for healing. Jack watched as his crew secured the warehouse and began gathering the intel they had fought so hard to obtain. This victory was important, but it was only the beginning. Jack knew that Blackwood wasn't the only one in the network. He still had to deal with the people who had helped him build his empire, the corrupt politicians, the crooked cops, the businessmen who thought they were untouchable. But for now, Jack allowed himself a brief moment of relief. The worst was over. The crew had done what they set out to do. They had taken down Viper's empire, dismantled Blackwood's operation, and made sure that Aisha would be safe from harm. Jack looked over at his crew, the men and women who had stood by him, who had fought and bled with him. "We did it," he said, his voice low but filled with pride. "This is what we came here to do. But we're not done yet. There's still work to be done." Vince, his right-hand man, gave him a small nod. "We'll take care of the rest," Vince said, his voice filled with quiet determination. One step at a time. Jack turned back to Aisha, who was standing near the door, her face a mixture of exhaustion and hope. "You're going to be okay," Jack said, giving her a reassuring smile. Aisha smiled back, though it was a little unsure. "I hope so," she said softly. Jack knew that this wasn't the end of her journey, but it was the start of something new. A new life, free from fear. And that was all that mattered now. He motioned for his crew to gather their things. "Let's go home," he said, his voice calm but resolute. As they walked out of the warehouse, Jack felt the weight of everything they had accomplished. They had taken down the man who had caused so much pain, and now, Aisha had a chance to live the life she deserved. But Jack knew that the fight for justice would never end. There would always be more battles to fight, more wrongs to right. But for now, this was enough. They had won, and that was all that mattered.